Welcome, Pony Jean, to my YouTube channel. I met Pony through Facebook, and I feel like we need to hear her story, especially because she has a book, an autobiography based
Hmm.
on her leaving the Jehovah's Witnesses. So, Pony, if you can talk about your story as Jehovah's Witnesses, how did the Jehovah's Witnesses come into your life, and then your story as one, and then what led you to write this book?
So I actually was born and raised as a Jehovah's Witness. My father born and raised as well. My mother was witnessed to in high school by a schoolmate. I actually come from, on my father's side, a long line of Jehovah's Witnesses. My grandparents, his parents moved to LA from Ohio. They went to serve where the need was great. And my great aunt on my dad's side is actually, she was when she was alive, a missionary in Uruguay. She's in the Proclaimers book. So she was the first missionary that went to Uruguay. So um, I was raised in it. Um, so obviously, like most of us who were raised in it for the majority of my life, I didn't know anything else other than that. And I assumed that that was what real life was and what we believed was the only right thing, and everyone else is confused, and the only people who knew the truth, etc. We've all been there. Um, I left when I was 30. There's kind of like a traumatic, kind of tumultuous way that led up to me leaving. Um, I did write my memoir. I go over it in the memoir kind of in detail of my leaving and what that means. But in leaving, just like majority of people who leave cults, I lost my entire family. My entire family disowned me. My children were legally taken from me. Um, I ended up in a mental health hospital. I deal with mental health issues. I've dealt with addiction. So this book kind of takes you through that journey from the beginning until not the end because I'm still alive, but um, through the end. And it started as like a legacy piece of myself because my memory is getting worse because of trauma. So I intended to write this to have for myself. And I ended up getting connected with a publisher here in Nashville. And the phone call was intended for her to give me advice of how to write it in a way that would be, legible and I would able to read in the future just for myself. And I inadvertently pitched the book to her on a 2-hour phone call. So then she asked me to sign with her. And then I was like, okay, now I have to write this book. And that very quickly turned into, she told me I had to think of what I was trying to convey. What was the point? Right. And for me, that point became sharing my story so that others going through this or had gone through this would find someone to relate to so that you didn't feel so alone and isolated, felt like somebody else understood to help bring some almost like normalcy to how you feel. I feel like a lot of us, when we go through this, you feel so alone and isolated, and you feel like you're the only person who's ever thought these things or felt these things or had to deal with these things. And I wanted to be able to portray that to others so that they understood not only are they not alone, but there's so many of us out there. So the goal here was to write this as bold and raw and honest as I could, even though not all things I really wanted to admit that people know about. There's some really weird things in there that I've never told anybody else, but I was like, this is the only way I'm going to be able to do it. So explain and share my whole story. And then actually at the end of the book, after the story has ended, I have copies of all of my history of treatment. So I have letters from my therapist. I have my history of treatment, clinical reports from the mental health hospital, from my rehab, and I've included all of that stuff so that everyone can fully understand like how kind of real and raw this is. So I felt like that was the only way I could really connect with others so they can see like this is it. Like I am not hiding anything, and so they feel they don't have to hide either. You know, that was kind of like the purpose of writing this once it became like a real thing that I was having to do.
I I totally understand. I'm so curious if you can share, was it something specific that woke you up to leave the organization, this or just something happen?
So, you know, it started when I was probably around 12, 13, 14, like around that time, because I think most of us know when you're raised in it, that's about the age that it starts being pushed on you to get baptized, right? So, like, those are the ages where it's like, you're thinking about getting baptized, weren't you baptized yet? And if there's a kid in the congregation who's around that age and gets a little bit older and they're not baptized, then something's wrong. And it's kind of like that whole stigma that comes with it, right? So, around that time is when I started not understanding some of the teachings and I was questioning it. And, you know, obviously we're taught you cannot question, you know, that makes you an apostate. And, you know, who would I even go to with these questions? Because I would just get met with upset if I were to even ask anybody. So that's kind of where it started, is I didn't understand. I think my biggest thing was, I remember when I was really young, I didn't understand why we couldn't be friends with people who weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, because we were supposed to go door to door and preach to them to get them to become a Jehovah's Witness. So I was like, well, why wouldn't I want to be friends with them? Because if I was friends with them, then they'd want to be Jehovah's Witness. So like I was always so confused about that. I was really confused about how much of a tyrant Jehovah was actually portrayed. Um, Although we were supposed to believe he was this super loving God who was going to provide all these wonderful things for us if we stayed loyal to him. But yet I was kept up to this unmeasurable level of perfection, as we all were, to have to be uh, in order to gain his favor and like not be killed, right? So things just were not adding up. And it just kept happening as I got older and older. And it just, I had just an unknown gut feeling in me that was just like, this ain't it. This is not it. And that actually kept me from ever getting baptized, which I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, because I know those who have been baptized and get this fellowship go through a big deal, as we all do. But um, I'm grateful that I didn't have to go through that. Although I think with leaving, I don't know that we all go through something leaving. So um, what ultimately led to me leaving was I had been married for the second time, and he had left me. He was a baptized Jehovah's Witness, and I was really upset about it. You know, I was crying a lot and really depressed. I was pulling out my hair in my sleep, like it was a whole thing. And the elders kept saying, you know, if you need help, come to us. So I went to the elders one night after a meeting, and I was like, I just can't stop crying and I'm really upset. And they literally looked at me and said, if you're not over it, this was 3 weeks after he left, by the way. If you are not over this by now, you are doing something wrong in Jehovah's eyes and you need to figure it out. And that's why you're suffering. And that was the last time I ever attended a meeting of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Wow, that's really harsh. And I've heard elders say incredibly harsh things. And at this point, you were so raw and vulnerable, trying to go to the Kingdom Hall, trying to get the comfort that you needed at that time.
Yes.
And then you were hit with this. So that was, you said 10 years ago. And then did you have kids?
That moment happened when I was 27. So
Okay.
I never attended a meeting at 27 or ever again, but I would go to the memorial with my parents. I went with them to their congregation, to their memorial. And I still kept up a facade of pretending like I was so that I didn't lose absolutely everybody, like including like friends that I had that were Jehovah's Witnesses, because they just weren't in my congregation. So like I was convinced they just didn't know, right? Because how would they know if I was going to meeting or not? They weren't in my congregation. So um
I'm
I ended up
curious,
leaving with,
I'm sorry, I'm curious, was there ever any pressure to get baptized?
oh yeah. I mean, constantly.
Mm.
Um, and I very much did get that stigma around me when I was a teenager, an older teenager within the congregation I grew up in, the stigma of, you know, being presented onto my mother as well, of like, what's wrong with her? Why isn't she getting baptized? Sisters in the congregation, pioneers in the congregation who are constantly coming up to me, telling me they will study with me so that I can get baptized. I did that a few times because I knew that's what everyone wanted, and it never led to anything. And then, um, I go over it in the book with my first marriage. After I got married, there was a huge push for me to get baptized. My first husband was baptized, and he was actually the father of an elder. I mean, he was the son of an elder. So that was thrown in there too, right? So I did it again. When we first got married, I studied with a sister studying towards baptism, and that eventually started falling off as well. I struggled with that a lot in my 20s of putting forth that effort because I felt like I had to fulfill this duty, right? And also, when bad things happened in my life, it wasn't, to me, I was, some of it was making poor decisions, but in my mind, because I was indoctrinated, it was put into my mind that I wasn't doing enough for Jehovah, and because I wasn't baptized, I was being punished, right? So the push to get baptized really followed and haunted me for until I left. Because I kept getting older and older and I wasn't baptized, and everyone knew I was born and raised in it. So like something was wrong. Wrong.
So your husband left, you were 26. This was your second husband, and
Yeah.
walk us through what happened. And another thing, I never said anything about your book. Your book sounds amazing. I absolutely love how raw, vulnerable, and real it is. I am all about vulnerability and sharing your authentic truth. And it sounds like you couldn't have done a more authentic piece than what you've uh, put out there. And I know we had talked a little bit about through text messages, there's so much kind of like this anger and rage still in the ex-Jehovah's Witness space. And it seems like you've worked through so much of that, all of this over decade of leaving the witnesses. So yeah, I really commend you on that. So if you can just take us back a little bit to 26 years old, that happened to you. How many children did you have? And was that with your first husband or with your second husband?
So I had the children with my first husband. We got married. I had been 18 for 2 months when we got married. And I'll be very honest with you. I got married because I wanted everybody to leave us alone, and I was sick of living at home, and I wanted to be like an adult and do my own thing. And that was really the main reason why we got married. I'll be very honest. I had 2 children with him.
Was he a
I love
witness?
my children.
I'm
He
sorry, was he?
he was Jehovah's Witness at the time. His father was an elder,
It's
so he
very
was Jehovah's
interesting
Witness.
because, okay, very interesting that you got married at 18 because I feel like that's kind of like the JW way and you weren't baptized. So you were still following all of
Correct.
like the baptized kind of rules
Yeah.
without actually being baptized. So, okay, so you got married at 18. Was he also 18?
Yes. He was 19.
Okay.
He was like 8 or 19 and a half. Anyways. But
You have
yes,
two
even though I was
kids?
not baptized, I still followed everything to a T of what was required of me because I was still trying to be accepted. So like I was doing everything I could of actually being baptized. But yes, we had 2 children. So I love my children. Obviously, I do not regret them, but I definitely was following protocol of you get married, you start having children young, you're fulfilling your duty as a Christian wife, and that's how all of these things kind of progressed. We ended up getting divorced. We were married for 4 years. We got divorced. I was 22. I got remarried at 25. And then we were married for like a year and 3 months, and we got divorced. So then that's kind of what really started leading up to me starting my transition out of the cult. After got divorced, I started attending school for cosmetology. I'm a hairstylist. And I started having quote unquote worldly friendships through school, but now I was an adult as opposed to being in an elementary school. Middle and high school, I was homeschooled. So my only real exposure to like worldly kids was in elementary school. So that really helped open up my eyes too, because I started formulating all these friendships with people, and some of them I'm still friends with to this day, of like people who have treated me better than any Jehovah's Witnesses ever treated me. And I started realizing this was not all I had always been taught, that there's actually good people in the world. You know, we're always taught everyone's so evil, you know. And then the things that happened with my divorce, where, you know, how I was explained, I just was treated. And I really got to a point where I was able to really start expressing myself and feeling like I could be myself, because I could be myself to these friends I had made. So that's where I started living a double life, which is so tiring and so just obviously not healthy. And I did that for a few years, where I was one way with my family. You know, my mom texting me, did you go and hear the talk this Sunday? Did you read the Watchtower article? And I would lie and tell her I did. And then the other hand, I was hanging out with my quote unquote worldly friends, being my true authentic self and feeling so happy. And I did both of that. I did that for years. And it was, looking back on it, it was horrible. It was so exhausting. And I finally got the courage to just do the one thing, which was be myself, because it made me so happy, you know. And I was surrounded by people who just loved me because of me, because I was a human being with a good heart, you know. And that's what led to the demise of losing my entire family. My family and my kids' father's family went to court and had my children legally taken from me. And that started a whole kind of downhill stumble into some really poor decisions that I made, and trauma and bad relationships. And I became addicted to alcohol, and I was using that as a way to deal, and kind of my journey through. And all of that is in my book, in detail of what that looks like, which I think was the main focus in the book, was going over those parts, because there's so many of us out there that feel like this. And I think some of us are scared to say it, or they feel they're not strong enough to say it. I'm saying it for all of us, so that others can feel better, and others can feel like, okay, it's not just me. Someone else out there feels like that. And it's okay that I feel this way. It's okay. That's kind of how that all,
I love that. I love that, Pony Jean. You know, I think most people are afraid to even tell their story because, as you know, like as ex-witnesses, once we broadcast that we're an ex-Jehovah's Witness, we're automatically an apostate, which categorizes us as pretty much demonic, which is ridiculous. And the fact that you're not only sharing your story, but also have gone into mass detail through your vulnerability about what happened after with your addiction.
yeah.
And all of that stuff. Another question is your kids, are they witnesses? And yeah, share about that if that's okay.
So my daughter, I still do not have a relationship with. Um, that's her decision. I was informed that she got baptized during COVID. So that was a hard day, but she's 19. Um, I feel like in time it'll change. My son does not identify as a Jehovah's Witness, which I'm very happy. He's almost 22. And he was never baptized. There's a lot of things because I now am in contact with my son, and I go through that in the book too. It's actually a really cool moment. Um, a lot of things that he shared with me mimic a lot of the things that I went through and how I thought and what I was questioning. So it's really interesting. Except he did it a lot sooner than I did, which I'm proud of him. Um, so him and I do have a relationship now. My daughter, not so much, but there's a whole lot that goes into that. But I know you and I have talked before when we met, and we were talking, and one of the things I wanted to convey, and a lot of the feedback and reviews I was getting from the book, is it's not a book full of angst and anger and uh just this harsh animosity against Jehovah's Witnesses. Yes, I blame them. I blame the organization. I blame them for a lot of things that happened in my life, obviously. Like my family disowned me because of their principles and their teaching. And I go over it in the book, like, um, the actual proof of statistics of what it does to a child growing up and how it actually alters their brain when they're indoctrinated and stuff, right? I admit, and I go over like what growing up Jehovah's Witness does to you as a child and the impacts it had on me. And then I move on. Like I don't want to give them the power to even like have this is how the hold they have on me. They don't have a hold on me anymore. And I truly believe so. And when I go through the book, I take a lot of accountability for things I did, and a lot of things I explain how they are. But it's not this book of like I'm this huge victim and there's all these other things. And I wanted it to be a book full of hope and a book to show you that you don't have to be so inundated and overwhelmed with having all this angst and anger and harboring all of these things for this organization. Um, one of my favorite sayings is it's like drinking poison and wishing the other person to die. And like that's literally where you're living when you're in that moment. And I don't mean to convey it in the sense of like it's that easy to just get over and move on. By the way, I'm never going to get over it. I don't forgive my family. I don't forgive the organization, but I can still run and find a place of peace and not have to say that's because I forgave them. There's no rule out there saying that in order to move on, I have to forgive. Like that's not like a thing. People can say it. People can say that's what you're supposed to do. It doesn't make it a thing. So, that's definitely something that I wanted to stress and convey is like you moving on doesn't mean you've forgiven. You can still move on. You can still let it go. You can still live this happy, fulfilling life without being overwhelmed and inundated with, the power they have over you of you sitting in your trauma and you sitting in what they've done to you. You can live a happy, fulfilling life, and you don't have to forgive them to do that. You don't. Like, and that was another point of writing this book and sharing this story is to share that, right? And that is a huge message that I wanted to give to people as well.
That's so true. And I think that there's a lot of people that are just meant to be sheep and follow a certain religion, cult, person, And some people are meant to be a witness, and to try to get them out, whether it's like their whole community is a Jehovah's Witness, or they feel they love the power of being an elder or a servant or whatever, like their why they're a Jehovah's Witness. To pull them out of that, it's like impossible because it's their whole world, as you said. And I think that, like I said in the beginning, I think some people are just meant to be witnesses. And everyone that I've spoken to in the videos, there's always like, I like you said, at 12, 13 years old, you knew. There was always a reason why they felt like that this is not the truth for them before. And I feel like every single witness, even the people in the governing body who are making up these rules, and all the other people, there's something that's like, what are we doing? But then everything's like, no, 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 let's leave this up to Jehovah, because Jehovah's going to take care of everything. So it's this, they just shut off their critical thinking and they just kind of follow the sheep. Like I said, I think a lot of people, and then there's the people that leave the Jehovah's Witnesses and go straight to another cult or into another very strong religious organization, again, because that sheep, they just need somebody to tell them what to do. They need morals to live by, like they can't question things within themselves. So that authentic self that you were describing before, when you were with your friends, like they're too afraid to live that life because they don't even know what that means. They need somebody else to tell them how to do that. Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to add.
So, and that, there's a lot of the things that you just brought up that tie back to trauma in itself and what that does to a person. So, a lot of people will end up joining another cult-like organization or group or whatever, because that's all they know. So that's how trauma ends up repeating itself and becoming generational, right? And a lot of people also will leave and go back because the same thing. That's all they know. There's a lot of people who leave and sit in their trauma because it's comfortable. It takes a lot of strength to go get the therapy and go to better yourself, because the unfamiliar is uncomfortable and people just want to stay in what's familiar. And sometimes your familiar is really bad trauma and it's really sad. I just wanted to add that about the things that you're making points on, like for people to understand it's just something that you're doing. Like this, there's a legitimate trauma response reason behind why some of these things happen like this, so that you understand this isn't just you. Like this is like a legitimate statistical thing when it comes to mental health, that reasons why this happened. And I say that in the sense of bringing comfort of like you understanding, okay, so another reason how it's not just me, there's so many other people that go through this. And this goes for anything. This doesn't just go for Jehovah's Witnesses. This goes for any people who are like people who are raised in domestic violence. This is the same thing that's going to happen. And this is how generationally women and men find themselves in other DV situations, because that's all they knew. That's how they're raised, and that situation is comfortable. It's the same type of reasoning.
Yeah, I think that's so important to relate to. I totally understand. And like you said, if you're used to your father screaming at your mom, unfortunately, that could be like you said, it's your normal. So I totally understand and agree. Um, Now going into your book, the I know you said in the beginning of our conversation the why of why you wrote it. How long did it take you to write it? And when you started writing it, did you know that it was going to be as vulnerable as it was, as you have it to be now?
No. So it's weird to me even now. I feel like when it's your own story, sometimes you become desensitized to actually kind of the weight of some of the things you've been through. So, it took me 2 years to write it. I think at one point I went 6 months without writing. there was many times where I was writing and I was like, this is the dumbest story I've ever heard. And I was like, why am I even doing this? And there was times where it made me so angry, and um since it's been released, I've had numerous people reach out to me commending me for my bravery and my spirit in being able to do this. And I'm so incredibly honored and grateful for these comments, and that I'm having the impact that it was intended. The impact that was intended is to help others. Like, that's all I care about. I don't care about myself getting notoriety or how many books I sell. I just want to help others. But at the same time, I'm like, I don't get it. Like, this is just my dumb story. Like, it's so weird, but that's how I feel sometimes, is like, I don't understand why anybody would care that much about my story. Like, I don't get it. So,
Vulnerability is like a magic serum. And I think the fact
yeah,
that you're like extra vulnerable with the most sensitive parts of you and you're putting it in this book
yeah,
really out there, not caring about what others think is really, really brave. And I think that
thank you.
your book could probably save a couple of lives if they did read it and they really did take it to heart. And if, like you said before, like if you can make it, they can make it too. And I think it's about just having that desire to live. If you can ask, I want to ask one question. In your darkest times, what was your why of like why you wanted to survive? Talk about that for a second. Where did you see yourself going? And what was the light at the end of the tunnel? Like what got you out of your dark hole?
In my darkest times, I have to be honest to say that I really don't know what pulled me out of it and what ended up saving my life. I'm very grateful that my life didn't end there, and I go through it in the book. There's many circumstances and instances where I should not be here right now. I really shouldn't. I don't know what really in this universe prevented or saved my life or kept me going. Um, but what really made the hugest difference for me is COVID. So a lot of really horrible things happened during COVID. I'm very well aware, and we lost a lot of people, and it affected a lot of people negatively, and it put in people into a lot of really bad spaces, in their head mentally, and did a lot of things. But for me, being in lockdown forced me, I had no other choice but to sit with all of my thoughts and emotions and trauma. And I needed to do something about it, because what else were we doing in lockdown? There was nothing to do, right? It forced my hand into having to deal head on with and properly all of my trauma and my thoughts and process them, which I had never done before. I thought I did, but I really didn't. And that's what made the hugest world of difference for me, is it forced that opportunity upon me. And I don't know that that would have ever happened if I did not have a lockdown. I'm gonna be very honest with you. So
Wow. Yeah, I think COVID did some good stuff for people as well. Go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
COVID was great for me. Like, I hate saying that, but and I go over that in the book too. Like, I explain all that, how that happened. Um, yeah. So that's really, thankfully I had gone through enough therapy, and I had already went through rehab at this point, that I had so many amazing tools at my disposal that I had learned through therapy. I've been in therapy for 10 years. I had so many different tools and resources and books and things at my disposal to help me in that journey. So it's not like I just sat in my room and thought about it all in process. Like, I definitely utilized the tools that are available out there to be able to do this in a healthy way. So there's that as well.
What is one thing you would recommend to somebody who is going through it right now? What is maybe like the best tool or advice that you can give somebody right now?
You have to go to therapy. I cannot explain this to or push this to enough people. And by the way, this is a message that I give to all of my friends and anyone I've ever met, whether or not they were born and raised in a cult. I think everybody should go to therapy. I know it's kind of scary, but let me tell you, there is something else about going and sitting with somebody once a week, once a month, however much you go, and being able to just talk so freely to somebody that knows absolutely no one in your life and no one's ever going to find out what you said. Like, once you put it into perspective that way, I think it gets a little easier because then you're like, okay, so I can finally get all these deep, dark things off my chest, right? And in a way that nobody's ever going to judge me, no one's ever going to find out. But also, you're talking to somebody who has gone through all this training and knows how to help and assist and guide you through these moments. Like that, why isn't that? To me, just sounds like the greatest idea. But that's definitely the thing I most suggest to people is find a therapist. Unfortunately and fortunately, religious trauma is so well known now and rampant throughout the nation and everywhere in the world that there are therapists out there who are trained in religious trauma. So we definitely do have that at our disposal, whereas we did not before. Like when I first started therapy 10 years ago, that was not a thing. Therapists didn't have that training. Therapists didn't know about it, and it was a little bit more difficult. That is not the same anymore. You can definitely find somebody out there who is trained in religious trauma that can help you. Also, there are many tools and resources out there wherever you live. You can find something in your city, in your state that will provide mental health for you at little or no cost. You just have to spend a little bit of time finding it, but I promise you it is there. So this is something that anybody watching this, anybody reading my book, anybody thinking about anything, it is definitely attainable for you and something that you can do.
The guy 2 interviews before this, he went in debt. He did therapy for the last 6 years, and he went in debt for therapy. He's like, it's the best money I've ever spent. Yeah, and I totally agree with you. Therapy is life changing. It really is. And therapists, counselors, and coaches in the space of just trying to help somebody is so important to talk to about it because as a coach who actually works with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, I've had a lot of ex-witnesses that say that it's really hard to find therapists that get the Jehovah's Witness trauma. But now, like you said, there are therapists that have that religious trauma knowledge, which is so key to help because the witnesses have a very specific kind of trauma that the average person will not understand and get. To be a 6-year-old looking at a Bible storybook with like hail falling from the sky and you still having nightmares about it in your 40s, it's like this deep impact that it had on you, and a typical therapist is not going to be able to really get that. So yeah, like you said, it's really important to find someone who has that knowledge and who has that education with religious trauma, which is a thing, like you said, is it's just recent. It's not something that has been known for a very long time, and it is a very big trauma that we carry, and it affects all our life. It's not just affecting a specific part of our life. The amount of fear that was instilled in us at such a young age carries on through every aspect of our life, whether it's our relationship with our partner, whether it's our work, whether it's the relationship we have with ourselves. So it trickles into all parts of our life. And until we can heal that root cause of that fear, it can be cured at the surface. It has to be at the root for it to get worked through. That's how trauma works. It's it's a journey. As I'm sure you would agree that healing is not linear, which means it's not just therapy that's going to help you or fix you. There's so many other aspects. What was that?
You have to do the work. You cannot just show up
Mm.
and something and then you're healed. Like there is a great amount of effort on your part as well that you have to give into it. And it sucks and
Exactly.
it's scary. It's not fun. Like I tell people, like going to therapy doesn't all of a sudden you're on this great journey. No, that's when it starts to get harder. Okay. So then there's definitely a time when you're working through and processing these horrible things that it's going to get 10 times worse and it's going to suck. Right. But on the other side of that is where you have that moment of you're so glad you did it and you become such a changed person by doing it, you know? And it makes it all worth it, I promise.
Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Point Jeans, I love this interview. Thank you so much for coming on my channel and sharing this
Yeah,
very raw and vulnerable story about you. And if they want to find your book, I'm going to put the link in the description notes. Is there
awesome.
anything you would want to add to this interview that you feel like you just wanted to add for missing out on?
I just want to say for whoever's watching this that you're brave as well, that you have it inside of you to heal and you're an amazing person and it's in there and you are not the trauma that happened to you. And hopefully this interview, hopefully your page, hopefully something else moves you to be able to take the steps towards healing for yourself. And I think you're so brave for doing so, and I think you deserve it.
Thank you so much. And I want to add that there's this we never felt like we were enough when we were in the organization. So I just want to say you are enough. You're addressing the
Yes,
people and I'm like, you are enough. You're enough to be exactly the person that you want to be. And you get to make that choice, essentially.
yes.
Thank you again, Pony Jane. I really appreciate it. And thank you for watching this interview. And until next